difficult at all?
No, I mean, I think people come up to me all the time, and they say, we love the show, and I just thank them for it.
There was a Saturday morning ritual that millions of Americans kept, not because they planned to, but because something about it felt necessary. They poured their coffee before it finished brewing, settled into their favorite chair, and turned on a show where a quiet man with a thick New England accent picked up a piece of wood and made something beautiful out of it. No drama, no shouting, no prizes or countdowns, just sawdust and skill and a stillness that was almost impossible to find anywhere else on television. For 21 years, Norm Abram showed up. Every single season, reliable as the wood grain he traced with his fingers, and then, without a goodbye that felt anywhere near big enough, it was over. The new Yankee workshop ended in 2009. No farewell special, no emotional final episode where he looked into the camera and said thank you, just a quiet conclusion and then a silence that stretched out far longer than anyone expected. And for years, the people who loved that show carried a question they couldn't quite put down. Why did it really end? Because the official answer, that the show had simply run its course, never sat right with the people who had watched every single episode. Shows that survive 2 full decades don't just drift quietly into the dark without a reason. There is always something underneath, something that never makes it into the official statement. What was actually happening inside that workshop while the cameras were rolling? What pressures were building in the rooms and boardrooms the audience never saw? What was Norm Abram carrying behind that steady smile, while he taught millions of people to measure twice and cut once? The story of how the new Yankee workshop ended is not a clean or simple story. It is a story about money, about loyalty, about institutional pressure, and about one man who gave the full weight of his life to a craft and had to watch the world around him quietly fall apart anyway. To understand what happened at the end, you have to go back to the beginning, not just the first episode, but back to what the show actually represented and why it mattered in a way that went far beyond woodworking. In 1989, public television in America was a genuinely different world. It was still a place where you could find real expertise, delivered without performance, where someone could sit in front of a camera and simply know things deeply, thoroughly, completely, and that knowledge alone was enough to hold an audience for an hour. No manufactured tension. No hosts competing for attention, just information delivered by someone who had earned the right to give it. Norm Abram was never supposed to become a television personality. That wasn't the plan, and it wasn't his nature. He had spent years working as a master carpenter, most famously alongside Bob Vila on This Old House, which had already built something real on PBS. He was the craftsman who showed up, did the actual work, and rarely said more than the job required. There was a quiet authority in him that cameras seemed to find even when he wasn't looking for it. The new Yankee workshop was in many ways a rare gift, a space that was entirely and genuinely his, a workshop designed around how he actually worked. Projects chosen because they reflected his real interests and his real level of skill. The show was never built around entertainment mechanics or clever production tricks. It was built around one man's ability to stand in front of a workbench and make something extraordinarily difficult look natural, approachable, and worth trying. And it worked. For years, it worked in ways that genuinely surprised the people who made it. The audience that found the show wasn't a casual one. These were people who taped episodes on VHS, rewound segments to catch a technique they almost missed, and took careful notes like students who actually cared about the subject. Woodworkers across America built the exact pieces Norm built, using the printed plans that came with the companion books, measuring and cutting and joining the way he had shown them. The relationship between Norm Abram and his viewers was something much quieter and more durable than celebrity. It was closer, really, to trust. WGBH, the Boston public television station behind the show, had something genuinely rare on their hands. A program that cost relatively little to produce, held a consistent and devoted audience, and generated real revenue through books, merchandise, and companion materials. For most of the show's run, the relationship between the production and its host seemed solid and straightforward. Norm showed up, the show delivered, the audience stayed. But institutions change in ways that don't always show on the surface. Funding structures shift, priorities quietly reorganize themselves. The pressures that would eventually reach the new Yankee workshop didn't arrive in a single moment. They built slowly, the way problems inside a wooden structure often do, invisible at first, and then suddenly impossible to ignore. For most of the 1990s and well into the early 2000s, the new Yankee workshop existed in a kind of golden, unhurried stability. The format barely changed from season to season. The workshop itself became as familiar as a room in your own house. The tools hanging in their exact same places, the wood stacked just the way it always was, Norm in his flannel shirt. Moving through each project with the same methodical, unrushed confidence. That consistency was never an accident. It was a deliberate and deeply respectful choice. Norm Abram understood something that many television producers never quite figured out, that the people watching weren't looking for novelty. They weren't waiting to be surprised. They wanted to sit down with someone who genuinely knew what he was doing and watch real competence in action. The show was, without ever calling itself this, a form of comfort television, long before that phrase existed or anyone thought to use it. The projects grew more complex and ambitious as the seasons moved forward. The techniques became more refined, the furniture more intricate. But Norm never abandoned the philosophy that had made the show work from the very beginning. Respect the wood, respect the tools, and above all, respect the person on the other side of the camera. Behind the scenes, the production at WGBH operated with a kind of confident institutional rhythm. The crew knew their roles. The relationships with sponsors and underwriters were established and stable. Woodworking tool manufacturers and lumber companies understood clearly the value of being connected to Norm Abram's name, because his audience trusted him. And that trust extended naturally to the things he used. It was a small, carefully built ecosystem, and it ran on authenticity. What matters most to understand is how completely Norm belonged to that world. This was not someone who showed up on taping days to deliver his lines and leave. Woodworking was the structure of his life. The projects he built on camera were things he would have built regardless of whether a lens was pointed at him. The enthusiasm wasn't performed. The care wasn't manufactured. And that realness, that total absence of pretense, was precisely what made what came next so much harder to absorb. Because for all the warmth and stability visible on screen, the larger world feeding that show had begun to quietly shift beneath the surface. Public television funding was facing structural pressures that had absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the programming or the loyalty of the audience. The economics of media were changing in large and irreversible ways, moving around a show that had been built on the quiet assumption that things of real value could simply continue. The mid-2000s brought changes to the public television landscape that most viewers never saw and never would have guessed. Federal funding for public broadcasting had been under consistent political and budgetary pressure for years by that point. Stations like WGBH were navigating an increasingly complicated financial reality, one built from a fragile combination of viewer donations, corporate underwriting, and the commercial performance of their own content. The ground beneath them was not as solid as it looked. For a show like the new Yankee workshop, this created a quiet and uncomfortable tension. The program was beloved. But beloved in the language of institutional finance doesn't automatically mean sustainable. Companion DVDs and printed plans and books could only carry so much weight in a media landscape that was reorganizing itself entirely around different platforms and different economics. The underwriting model that had supported thoughtful, slow-burn public television programming was being quietly renegotiated by forces far larger than any individual show could influence. At the same time, something was shifting inside Norm Abram's own experience of the show. According to various accounts from people connected to the production over the years, the relationship between Norm and WGBH was not without its complications as that final decade wore on. Questions about compensation, about creative direction, about what the long-term future of the show actually looked like, these had reportedly surfaced in conversations that never reached the audience. Nothing was publicized, nothing dramatic surfaced publicly. But inside the institution, according to those accounts, there were genuine tensions about how the show would move forward, and whether it would move forward at all. Norm himself has spoken carefully about this period in the rare interviews where it has come up. He has described the ending with a measured, quiet sadness, the kind that suggests the decision was not simple and was not entirely his to make. He has spoken openly about the physical demands of 2 decades of production, the years of standing on concrete floors, the toll that kind of work takes on a body over time. He has acknowledged that by the late 2000s, things felt different, in ways that he has consistently chosen not to detail in public. What emerged in the years leading up to the final season was a growing sense, at least within the world of the production, that the show had arrived at a crossroads it couldn't navigate its way around. The question was never whether Norm was still capable. He was. The question was whether the institutional structure surrounding him could still hold the weight of what the show needed to remain what it had always been. One of the most telling things about the way the new Yankee workshop ended is not what was said. It is what wasn't. There was no public disagreement, no announcement that landed with any weight. No interview where Norm sat down and explained honestly and fully what had happened. He simply stopped making the show. And the people who loved it were left to piece together the truth from fragments, from careful phrasing in interviews, from things said between the lines, from the long and very telling silence that followed. That silence in its own way says a great deal. When people who have spent decades in public life go quiet about something significant, it is usually because the reality is either too layered to explain in a few clean sentences, or because there are obligations, professional, legal, relational, that make full honesty genuinely complicated. In Norm's case, both of those things were very likely true at the same time. His relationship with WGBH, his ongoing role with the broader This Old House enterprise, his standing in the world of public television, all of these things were intertwined. Pulling on one thread risked pulling on all of them. What has been reported over the years points to several pressures arriving at the same moment. The financial difficulties at WGBH were real and documented. The station, like many public broadcasters across the country, was managing a prolonged era of declining federal support and shifting donor expectations. Production costs for the new Yankee workshop, while modest by commercial television standards, still demanded consistent institutional commitment. And that commitment, according to various accounts, became harder to sustain. There were also, reportedly, broader conversations happening about the direction of the This Old House brand as a whole. The media company that had grown around that name had its own strategic priorities, its own commercial pressures, and those priorities didn't always align naturally with what a quiet, solo workshop show needed in order to survive and thrive. And underneath all of that, though Norm has only ever touched on this carefully and indirectly, there was the deeply human reality of exhaustion. 21 years is a long time to give to anything. The physical toll was real, the creative toll was real. And the emotional weight of carrying a show that meant that much to that many people for that long is something that simply doesn't appear in any production budget, but it accumulates. Year by year, season by season, it accumulates. What gets lost most easily in conversations about why the show ended is the human being who was at the center of it all. Norm Abraham has always been an intensely private person. Not in a guarded or evasive way, more in the way of someone who has genuinely always believed that the work itself speaks more clearly than any words about it. And that most things in life simply don't need to be announced. That quality served him brilliantly on camera. It made him feel trustworthy in a way that is very difficult to manufacture. It made the show feel honest because it was honest. But it also meant that when real difficulties arrived in his professional world, he moved through them the way he moved through a difficult joint, quietly, carefully, without making the struggle visible. He kept showing up, he kept building, he kept teaching. People who worked alongside Norm over the years describe a man defined by unusual and genuine consistency, reliable, professional, committed to doing things correctly even when doing them quickly would have been easier. These are not the qualities of someone who walks out dramatically or issues public statements. They are the qualities of someone who, when faced with something painful, absorbs it and keeps moving. There is something worth slowing down for in that image. A man who spent 21 years teaching people how to build things meant to last, furniture passed down through families, pieces that would outlive the hands that shaped them, who then had to watch the thing he had built on television be quietly concluded by forces that were, in many honest ways, beyond his control. The loss, by all accounts from those close to the production, was not only professional, it carried a genuine grief, not bitterness. Norm Abraham has never appeared to be a bitter person, but grief. The quiet, private kind that settles in when something you loved deeply is simply over, and no available goodbye feels adequate to what it actually meant. His continued presence on This Old House through the years that followed spoke to a man who found a way to keep going. But those who have watched carefully have noted, over and over, that something in him shifted after the workshop closed. Because the new Yankee workshop was his in a way that nothing else ever quite was, not before it and not after. In the years since the show ended, something unexpected has happened. The new Yankee workshop has not faded the way most television content from that era has faded. It has, if anything, grown in quiet stature. Episodes from the early 1990s circulate freely online, shared between woodworking communities and maker forums as if they were current, as if the information hadn't aged a single day. For an entire generation of people who discovered the show as adults, who were children when it originally aired and found it later. Almost by accident, the experience has carried the particular quality of finding something that felt made specifically for them. That enduring relevance raises a question that sits quietly in the background of everything else. What would the show have become if the pressures had been different? What seasons were never made? What projects were never built on camera, never documented, never passed on to the people who would have learned from them? No serious revival effort has emerged, despite the obvious and genuine appetite for one among the woodworking community. Questions have been raised in those communities about whether the complexity of the rights situation, or the unresolved tensions between the parties involved, or simply the weight of Norm's own feelings about how it ended have made the conversation difficult to have in any productive way. No official conclusion has been reached on any of this. The silence in that regard has continued. Norm Abram has kept working. He has remained connected to the This Old House world, made appearances, given interviews, been present in the craft community in ways that matter. But the new Yankee workshop, as a living and continuing thing, has not come back. And the way it ended, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement proportionate to the relationship it had built with its audience over 2 full decades, still leaves something genuinely unresolved. What makes it particularly complex is that the show existed right at the intersection of several different worlds, each with its own pressures. Public television's funding struggles, the commercialization of media brands, the physical and emotional realities of a working craftsman's body and time and life, and the harder, more intangible weight of giving a significant portion of yourself to a creative project that belongs, in all the institutional ways that matter, to someone else. None of those factors, taken alone, fully explains what happened. But together they form a picture that is honest in the way that real endings almost always are, which is to say, quietly complicated. There is a particular kind of loss that arrives when something genuinely wholesome disappears without enough acknowledgement, not a tragedy in the loud sense, not a scandal. Just an absence, a space where something good used to be and now isn't, and the world moves on as though it were a small thing. The new Yankee workshop was, at its heart, a show about patience. About doing things correctly, even when doing them quickly was possible. About respecting the materials and the process, and the long, unbroken history of human craft that lives inside every dovetail joint and hand-cut mortise. It was a show that quietly insisted, week after week, season after season, for 21 years, that some things are worth taking time over, that the slow way is sometimes the right way. That care, real care, shows up in the finished work. The irony of how it ended, quickly, quietly, without the kind of thoughtful and deliberate send-off that the show had always stood for, is something that is not lost on the people who loved it most. What lingers when you sit with the whole story is not really a mystery in the end. The mystery was always just the distance between what we see on a screen and what is actually happening in the lives and institutions and pressures that exist behind it. Norm Abram kept building. WGBH kept changing. The world of media kept moving in directions that made it progressively harder for quiet, honest, unhurried programming to survive on its own terms and its own merits. But what the show left behind has proven harder to dissolve than the circumstances that ended it. The plans, the techniques, the episodes watched and rewatched across decades. The specific sound of Norm's voice when he explained something with complete certainty and complete calm, those things have persisted. They have traveled further from that original workshop than any production meeting or budget discussion ever imagined possible. He used to say it often in various forms across all those years: measure twice, cut once. It was practical instruction, but it was also, in the quietest possible way, a philosophy for living. Think before you act, understand what you are working with, recognize that mistakes in wood, like mistakes in life, are sometimes correctable and sometimes not. The ending of the new Yankee workshop was, perhaps, one of those cuts that couldn't quite be taken back. Made under pressures that were real and understandable by people navigating genuinely difficult circumstances. but leaving something unfinished nonetheless. A project set aside before it was truly complete. And the people who poured their coffee on Saturday mornings and sat down and gave that show their time and their attention and their genuine affection, they feel that incompleteness still. Not with bitterness, with something softer and more enduring than that. With the particular ache that comes from loving something that was genuinely good, and understanding with full clarity that things that are genuinely good are far rarer than they should be. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and leave a thought in the comments below. Maybe you grew up watching the show with someone you loved. Maybe you only found it recently and felt something you didn't quite expect. Either way, there is something worth saying about why it still matters, and why the quiet endings are so often the ones that leave the deepest mark. If you want more stories told this carefully, this honestly, subscribe and stay close. There is always more beneath the surface.